Assalamu alaikum, let's explore this Islamic topic together. Hey, so, you know how we were talking about Islam the other day? Well, I was reading up on something really fascinating. It's all about Islamic law, Sharia, and how it's interacted with social reform throughout history. It's way more interesting than it sounds. I promise. See, you might think of Islamic law as this super rigid, unchanging thing, but the reality is way more nuanced. It's a huge, evolving body of legal thought that's been shaped by centuries of interpretation and debate. And that's where the social reform part comes in. It's not just about rules and regulations. It's about how those rules have been applied and reinterpreted to address the social, economic, and political realities of different times and places. It's a really important lens through which to understand Islam's history. Think about it. Islam arrived in a vastly different world than the one we live in today. The early Islamic community, during the time of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, and the first few centuries after, faced immense challenges, building a new society from scratch, navigating power dynamics with other empire, dealing with issues of justice, equality, and social harmony within a rapidly expanding community. Sharia, in its essence, provided a framework for addressing these challenges. Now, Sharia isn't a single, static. It's the Quran, the holy book of Islam, and the Sunnah, the teachings and practices of the Prophet Muhammad. But the interpretation and application of these primaries have always been of lively intellectual discussion among Islamic scholars. Different schools of thought, different legal opinions emerged, and this diversity itself has been a catalyst for social reform. For example, early Islamic jurists grappled with issues like slavery. While the Quran doesn't abolish slavery outright, it lays down rules to mitigate its harshness and encourages manumission, freeing slaves. Over time, many scholars advocated for abolition and developed legal mechanisms to facilitate pay. This shows how even within a framework of established religious law, people found ways to push for social justice and gradual reform. It wasn't a simple, overnight change, but a slow, evolving that took centuries. Another area where we see this interplay between Islamic law and social reform is in the realm of women's rights. Again, the Quran significantly improved the status of women compared to pre-Islamic Arabian society, granting them rights to property ownership, divorce, and inheritance. But the interpretation and application of these rights have varied throughout history, with some periods witnessing greater gender equality than others. Think about the significant roles women played in early Islamic society. Scholars, poets, business owners. Their contributions challenge the often presented monolithic image of women in Islamic history. Similarly, consider the different interpretations of jihad. While it's often misunderstood in the West as solely meaning holy war, a crucial aspect of jihad is the internal struggle to live a virtuous life, a personal spiritual striving for self-improvement. This internal jihad directly ties into social reform by encouraging individuals to strive for a more just and compassionate society. The application of the concept to external conflict, however, has been of both positive and negative interpretations throughout history, and continues to be a site of ongoing debate within Islamic thought. The story of Islamic law and social reform is also incredibly diverse geographically. Think about the vast expanse of the Islamic world, from Spain to Indonesia, from Africa to Central Asia. Each region has its own unique historical its own cultural norms, and its own interpretations of Islamic law. This leads to a fascinating tapes of legal practices and social developments. For instance, the legal systems that developed in the Ottoman Empire differed significantly from those in Mughal India, reflecting the specific social, political, and economic realities of each empire. Moreover, the interaction between Islamic law and broader societal shifts is also crucial. The impact of colonialism, modernization, and globalization on Islamic societies has also shaped the way Islamic law is understood and practiced today. Many Muslim communities found themselves grappling with the tension between their traditional legal systems and the demands of modern nation-states. This tension often resulted in creative reinterpretations of Islamic law to address contemporary challenges like human rights, democracy, and economic development. So, seeing Islamic law and social reform through a historical lens is essential. It highlights the dynamic and evolving nature of Islamic legal thought, and shows how it has responded to both internal and external pressures. It reveals the ongoing dialogue between religious principles and social realities, a conversation that continues to this day. It also demonstrates the amazing range of human experience within the Islamic world, challenging stereotypes and offering a more nuanced understanding of a complex and multifaceted faith. It's not a simple story, but a rich and deeply engaging one of adaptation, reform, debate, and ongoing evolution. It's a history worth exploring. Hey, so, you want to know about Islamic law and social reform? It's a fascinating story, way bigger than you might think. It's not just dusty old books. It's about real people, real problems, and real attempts to make a better world, all within a very specific religious and historical framework. Imagine the 7th century, the Arabian Peninsula, hot, dry, mostly tribal societies squabbling over res and power. Then, bam, Muhammad, the prophet, begins to preach a new message of monotheism, justice, and compassion. This wasn't just a religious revolution, it was a complete societal upheaval. Before Islam, tribal laws and customs reigned supreme, often harsh, arbitrary, and heavily reliant on blood feuds and revenge. Think about it. Women had limited rights, orphans were vulnerable, the poor were exploited, and social structures were rigid. Islam, with its core belief in one God and the inherent dignity of all humans, presented a radically different vision. The Quran, Islam's holy book, became the foundation for a new legal system, Sharia. But Sharia isn't some static, unchanging set of rules. It's a dynamic interplay between the Quran's principles, the Prophet Muhammad's example, the Sunnah, and scholarly interpretation, ijtihad, that adapted over centuries. Now, the early days weren't all sunshine and roses. Think of it as building a new house on an old, shaky foundation. You have these incredible, revolutionary ideals about equality, justice, and social responsibility, but you're also grappling with ingrained cultural practices and prejudices. The early caliphs, the successors to the Prophet, faced monumental tasks. They had to establish a just legal system, create effective governance, and integrate diverse populations into this new, rapidly expanding empire. One of the immediate impacts of Islamic law was the significant improvement in the status of women. While still not equal in all aspects to men by modern standards, Islamic law offered women protection they'd never had before. They gained rights related to marriage, divorce, inheritance, and property ownership, rights that were far ahead of their time in much of the world. The Quran explicitly condemned female infanticide, a common practice at the time, and emphasized the importance of family and respecting women's dignity. This isn't to say it was perfect. Of course, the interpretation and application of these laws varied across different regions and time periods, leading to diverse societal outcomes. Sometimes, the very principles of justice were twisted to justify existing power structures or societal biases. That's a crucial thing to remember. The history of Islamic law isn't a straightforward narrative of continuous progress. Over time, different schools of Islamic jurisprudence emerged, each with their own interpretations of the Quran and the Sunnah. This led to fascinating debates and discussions about the best way to apply Islamic law in various cons. Scholars argued over the details of criminal justice, family law, commercial transactions, all to strive for a more just and equitable society. Now, social reform within this Islamic legal framework was often intertwined with broader historical movements. Think about the Golden Age of Islam, a period of immense intellectual and cultural flourishing. Scholars, poets, and scientists made groundbreaking advancements in many fields, while simultaneously engaging in philosophical and theological discussions that profoundly impacted social attitudes. Many reformers, inspired by Islamic principles, championed causes like the abolition of slavery, the promotion of education, and the advancement of social justice. However, these reforms often faced resistance from powerful groups who benefited from the status quo. So you have these ongoing tensions between the ideal of a just and equitable society envisioned by Islam and the realities of power, politics, and cultural inertia. Sometimes, social reforms came about through gradual shifts in interpretation and application of Islamic law. Sometimes, they resulted from major social movements and even revolutions. Throughout Islamic history, individuals and movements have consistently used Islamic teachings to challenge injustice and advocate for change. That continuous dialogue, that tension between tradition and reform, is what makes the story so compelling. It's a complex tapes woven with threads of religious belief, political power, social change, and human struggle. It's a story of both remarkable achievements and undeniable shortcomings, constantly evolving and adapting to new challenges. Studying Islamic law and social reform is essentially studying how a faith attempted to grapple with the ever-changing needs of a diverse and dynamic society over many centuries. And it's still a story that's being written today. Okay, so we've covered the early days of Islamic law, right? The basics, the foundational principles laid down by the Prophet Muhammad and his companions. Now, things get really interesting. Because the middle chapters, as you might call them, that period from, say, the 8th to the 13th centuries, is where Islamic law really blossomed. But also where it faced some serious challenges and underwent some incredible transformations. Think about it. The Islamic world was exploding in size and influence. We're talking vast empires spanning continents, incredible intellectual ferment, advancements in science, mathematics, medicine, the list goes on. This naturally impacted how Islamic law was understood and applied. It wasn't just a static set of rules. It was a living, breathing thing, constantly interacting with the complexities of daily life within these huge, diverse societies. One of the biggest things we see during this period is the rise of different schools of legal thought, the madhabs. It's not like there was a single, universally agreed upon interpretation of the Quran and Sunnah, the Prophet's teachings and practices. Different scholars, with different backgrounds and approaches, interpreted these in slightly different ways, leading to different legal opinions. This wasn't necessarily a conflict. It was more like a vibrant intellectual debate. with each school contributing its own insights and perspectives. Think of it like having different schools of thought in, say, modern-day legal systems. Some might lean more conservative, others more progressive. It's the same basic principles, but different interpretations and applications. And that brings us to the social reforms. The sheer scale of the Islamic Empire meant encountering all sorts of different legal and social customs. How did Islamic law grapple with pre-existing laws and traditions in newly conquered lands? How did it address issues of slavery, taxation, trade, and social justice in such a vast and diverse population? This is where things get fascinatingly complex. For instance, think about slavery. Islamic law did not invent slavery, but it attempted to regulate and limit it. There were rules about the treatment of slaves, stipulations about manumission, freeing slaves, and attempts to mitigate the harshest aspects of the system. But this wasn't always uniformly implemented, and the reality of slavery varied significantly across different parts of the empire. Influenced by pre-existing cultural norms and the economic realities of the time. The point is, there were continual debates and discussions, even legal rulings, about improving the condition of slaves and reducing the prevalence of slavery. Similarly, we see significant engagement with issues of social justice. Scholars debated extensively about the rights of the poor, the vulnerable, and the marginalized. Think about concepts like zakat, charity, and waqf, endowment. These weren't just religious obligations. They were crucial mechanisms for social welfare and redistribution of wealth. They were constantly reinterpreted and adapted to address the changing needs of the society. Legal opinions evolved around things like fair pricing, preventing exploitation, and ensuring access to basic necessities. Now, this period wasn't just about incremental changes. We also see moments of significant social reform spearheaded by individuals who used legal frameworks to advocate for change. Think about figures who challenged existing norms and sought to improve the lives of the less fortunate. These reformers weren't necessarily aimed to change Islamic law, but rather to interpret and apply it in ways that led to positive social outcomes. But here's the crucial thing. This wasn't always a smooth, progressive arc. There were powerful forces of resistance to change, and plenty of debates and disagreements about the proper application of Islamic law in different cons. Sometimes, reformers faced significant opposition, and the implementation of even the most well-intentioned reforms could be uneven and inconsistent. The history is filled with both successes and years, triumphs and setbacks. This interplay between the established legal system and the desire for social reform is what makes this period so compelling. It highlights the inherent dynamism of Islamic law, its ability to adapt and evolve while still grounding itself in its core principles. It also reveals the ongoing tension between legal tradition and the lived realities of diverse communities throughout history. It's not a simple story of progress or decline, but a rich tapes of human experience, intellectual debate, and the ongoing struggle to create a more just and equitable society. All within the framework of Islamic law. So, the middle chapters are far from a boring interlude. They're the heart of the story, a period of immense growth, intellectual innovation, and ongoing efforts to shape Islamic law into a tool for social good. It's a fascinating period that continues to inform and inspire discussions about the relationship between religion, law, and society today. And it's a story far from over. Okay, so we've been talking about how Islamic law, the Sharia, has interacted with social reform throughout history, right? It's a fascinating story, a real roller coaster, actually. And as we near the end of this whole conversation, I think what's important to understand is that it didn't conclude with a neat little bow. There's no single ending, no grand finale. Instead, it's more like a continuing conversation, a constantly evolving dialogue. Think about it. Islamic law, at its core, aims to create a just and equitable society. But what constitutes just and equitable has shifted dramatically over time and across different cultures. What worked in 7th century Arabia, and even then, there was debate, isn't necessarily going to work perfectly in 21st century Indonesia or Morocco or even within different communities within the same con. The early centuries after the Prophet Muhammad's death saw a period of immense expansion of the Islamic empire. Legal scholars, the *fuqaha*, were busy codifying and interpreting the Quran and the Sunnah, the Prophet's teachings and practices. They were grappling with completely new situations, new challenges, how to govern vast territories with diverse populations, how to deal with different legal systems they encountered. They developed sophisticated legal frameworks. But even then, there were different schools of thought, different interpretations, leading to different legal outcomes. It wasn't a monolithic block of law. It was incredibly dynamic. Then, you have periods where Islamic law was used to promote social reform. Think about the Great Islamic Golden Age. This wasn't just about scientific advancements and philosophical breakthroughs. It was also about social progress. Thinkers like Ibn Khaldun, for example, analyzed social structures and the rise and fall of civilizations, offering perspectives that were way ahead of their time. His ideas, although not directly part of the Sharia itself, certainly influenced the social and political landscape. Similarly, there were movements aimed on improving the lives of the poor and oppressed, often drawing on the ethical principles within Islamic teachings. Zakat, the obligatory charitable giving, wasn't just a religious obligation, it was a crucial mechanism for social welfare. But then, there were periods where things got complicated. The rise of powerful empires sometimes saw the twisting of Islamic law to serve the interests of the rulers, rather than the people. You see examples of this throughout history, where legal interpretations were manipulated to maintain hierarchies or to justify unjust practices. This isn't to say the law itself was inherently flawed, but its application could be, and was often, subject to considerable manipulation. The colonial era brought its own set of challenges. External powers often interfered in legal systems, sometimes undermining traditional practices and sometimes imposing their own, which wasn't always beneficial. And then you had the rise of various reform movements within the Muslim world itself, movements that challenged traditional interpretations of the Sharia, arguing for interpretations more relevant to modern times. The 20th and 21st centuries have seen a huge upswing in the discussion and debate around Islamic law. With globalization, migration, and rapid technological advancement, traditional legal frameworks are being questioned and reinterpreted in light of new realities. This involves wrestling with issues like women's rights, human rights, environmental issues, areas where the traditional S of Islamic law might not have clear answers, or where different interpretations clash. So, the conclusion to this story isn't a single event. It's a constant dialogue between traditional legal frameworks and the evolving needs of society. It's about finding ways to adapt the core principles of justice, fairness, and compassion that are at the heart of Islamic law to the challenges of a constantly changing world. It's about asking how we can best use these principles to build more just and equitable societies. It's not a simple story of progress or decline. It's a complex, multifaceted history filled with both successes and yours, with periods of great progress intertwined with periods of stagnation or even regression. And it's a story that continues to unfold. A story that requires ongoing critical engagement, open dialogue, and a deep understanding of both the historical core and the contemporary challenges we face. The relationship between Islamic law and social reform remains a vibrant, essential, and ongoing conversation. Hey, so we were talking about Islamic law and social reform, right? It's a huge topic, but thinking about its historical perspective really puts things in perspective for us today. You know, it's not just some dusty old book. It's a living, breathing part of our history, shaping how we understand Islam itself. Imagine this: Islamic law, Sharia, wasn't just handed down in one big bang. It evolved over centuries, reacting to incredibly diverse situations. Think about the early caliphate, that period right after the Prophet Muhammad's death. They were grappling with enormous challenges, expanding an empire, managing different cultures and legal systems, dealing with massive social change. They had to figure out how to apply core Islamic principles, justice, compassion, community, to completely new situations. For example, they had to deal with non-Muslims living within the Islamic Empire. Islamic law, even then, recognized the rights of dhimmis, protected people of the book, Jews and Christians mainly. They had their own courts, their own religious practices, and were subject to a different set of taxes. But they weren't forced to convert. That's a big deal, right? It shows how Islamic law, from the very beginning, wasn't about imposing a uniform system, but about finding ways to build a just society with diverse populations. Then, as the empire grew, you had different schools of legal thought emerging. Think of it like different interpretations of the same, but all rooted in the Quran and the Sunnah, the Prophet's teachings and practices. These schools, like the Hanafi, Maliki, Shafi'i, and Hanbali schools, developed different approaches to legal issues, their understanding of the primary is, but also the specific needs and cons of their regions. This isn't about one right way, but about engaging with the law in a dynamic and evolving way. Now, fast forward a few centuries. We see amazing periods of intellectual and cultural flourishing, like the Golden Age of Islam. This wasn't just about science and philosophy, it was also a time of intense legal scholarship. Think about scholars like Imam al-Ghazali, who worked to reconcile philosophy and theology, influencing not just legal interpretations but also how Muslims understood their faith in a broader sense. His work shaped how people viewed Islamic law, emphasizing its spiritual dimensions and ethical implications. But the story isn't always about smooth progress. Throughout history, we also see moments of social injustice and oppression, moments where Islamic law was used to justify actions that are clearly against its core principles. For instance, the institution of slavery existed within Muslim societies for centuries. While Islamic law provided frameworks for treating slaves with some humanity, far better than many other contemporaneous systems, the reality was often far from ideal. Scholars debated the morality and legality of slavery throughout history, and movements for abolition existed within Muslim communities. Understanding this complex history allows us to critically examine how Islamic law has been interpreted and applied, and to learn from past mistakes. And this brings us to modern times. Today, Many Muslims are grappling with how to apply Islamic law in a rapidly changing world. We are facing new challenges: globalization, technological advancements, human rights issues that the scholars of the past couldn't have even imagined. So, what does this historical perspective teach us? It teaches us that Islamic law isn't static. It's a dynamic system that has always adapted to new cons. It highlights the importance of ijtihad, independent legal reasoning, in addressing contemporary issues. We can't simply rely on past interpretations without critically engaging with them. We need to understand the historical con of those interpretations and ask ourselves, are they still relevant today? How can we apply the core principles of justice, compassion, and community to the specific challenges we face? Studying Islamic law's historical perspective helps us to appreciate the diversity of interpretations within Islam. It reminds us that there's not one single, Islamic, viewpoint on any issue. Instead, there's a rich tapes of opinions, debates, and interpretations that reflect the ongoing of engaging with our faith. It also teaches us humility. It shows us that even in the past, Muslims weren't always perfect in applying their faith. They made mistakes. They struggled with contradictions, and they grappled with complex ethical dilemmas. Acknowledging this helps us to be more critical and self-reflective in our own understanding and application of Islamic law. Finally, studying this history gives us tools to engage in meaningful conversations about social reform. Within a Muslim con, it allows us to articulate our values, challenge injustices, and advocate for positive change, rooted in the rich and evolving tradition of Islamic legal thought. We can learn from past successes and yours, and apply those lessons to building a more just and equitable world today. So, it's not just about memorizing historical facts. It's about engaging critically with our past to better shape our future. It's about understanding the con, acknowledging the complexities, and using this rich history to build a better tomorrow. What do you think? It's a lot to think about, isn't it? Goodbye. May Allah bless us all. That's our discussion for today.